You are not here by accident, and nothing about this moment needs to be explained. There is a quiet accuracy to the timing, a precision that doesn't announce itself. You may have felt it before noticing it, a subtle easing somewhere behind the breath, as if a pressure you learned to carry has loosened without asking permission. Not relief exactly, more like space, returning to where tension had been normalized. You didn't arrive searching. This wasn't pulled in by effort or desire. It appeared because something in you crossed a threshold without drama. The system you move through noticed the absence of resistance before you did. When restriction lifts, it doesn't come with fireworks. It comes as neutrality, as the strange sense that nothing needs to be fixed right now. There may have been a period where clarity felt delayed, where signals seemed faint or inconsistent. Not confusion in the loud sense, but a low-grade, dulling, like moving through days wrapped in cotton. That wasn't failure or stagnation. It was containment. When the observer is recalibrating, the field quiets first. Sensation softens, urgency fades. The pattern pauses, so coherence can form underneath awareness. You might recognize this as the moment when striving stops working, when pushing produces no additional movement. That isn't because something closed, it's because something finished. Systems don't announce completion, they simply stop requesting energy. The anomaly resolves itself, and the nervous system interprets that resolution as stillness. Notice how there's nothing here demanding belief, no instruction to accept or reject. Recognition doesn't require agreement, it only requires detection. And detection happens when the internal noise floor drops low enough for a signal to register. That's what's occurring now, not an activation, a confirmation that activation already passed. If there has been a subtle fatigue, it came from holding a posture longer than necessary, staying alert after the alert was no longer needed. The body learned to scan for threat, for change, for the next instruction. When restriction lifts, scanning becomes inefficient. Awareness settles back into its original rhythm. Time feels less segmented. Thoughts lose their sharp edges. You don't need to understand why this happened now. The mind always wants sequence and cause. But coherence doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in phases of readiness. Something in you reached sufficient stability for the surrounding conditions to reorganize. The timeline adjusted to match what was already true internally. This isn't about becoming more. It's about noticing what no longer applies. Old feedback loops fail to trigger. Emotional reactions that once felt automatic arrive late or not at all. Silence appears between impulses. In that silence, there is no command, only presence. Stay with the absence of urgency. Let it orient you. When a restriction lifts, the first sign is not expansion. It's the end of compression, the sense that nothing is pressing in on you from the inside. Just this moment, intact, unremarkable, and precisely aligned. As the compression eases, something else becomes noticeable, not as a new sensation but as the absence of friction. You may sense that familiar internal dialogue losing momentum, like a machine left running after its task is done. Thoughts still arise, but they don't hook in the same way. They pass through without insisting on response. This isn't detachment. It's alignment catching up to itself. There was a time when attention had to work hard, when awareness stayed slightly ahead of experience, monitoring, predicting, bracing. That posture kept things functional, but it also consumed energy quietly. When restriction lifts, that posture dissolves on its own. Vigilance gives way to a softer form of observation, one that doesn't lean forward. You're still present, but no longer positioned against anything. You might notice a subtle recalibration in how you relate to your inner signals. Emotions that once arrived as commands now arrive as information. Sensations register without demanding interpretation. Even discomfort feels less personal, more like weather passing through a stable environment. The observer is still active, but no longer entangled with the data it receives. This is often mistaken for numbness, especially if intensity was once used as proof of aliveness. But numbness is constriction. What's happening here is spaciousness. The nervous system is no longer amplifying inputs to compensate for instability. When coherence increases, amplification becomes unnecessary. Sensitivity doesn't disappear, it refines. There may be moments where the mind tries to reassert old roles, searching for the familiar tension of striving. It may ask, what comes next? What should be done with this openness? Notice how those questions feel slightly out of place, like echoes from a room you've already left. They don't land because the system no longer requires answers to proceed. The quantum field responds differently when observation is steady. Patterns reorganize without announcement. Interactions feel cleaner, less charged. Not because circumstances changed, but because the internal reference point shifted. When the observer stops oscillating, the surrounding field stabilizes. Cause and effect appear closer together. Things resolve with fewer steps. You might recognize this as a quiet confidence that doesn't narrate itself. Not optimism, not certainty. Just an underlying sense that movement will happen when it's appropriate, without force. This isn't trust as a belief, it's trust as a physiological state. Muscles soften, breath deepens without instruction. Time feels less urgent. If there was confusion before, it came from trying to interpret signals while the receiver was still tuning. Static was mistaken for meaning. Now, with the tuning complete, the absence of noise feels unfamiliar. The mind looks for content where there is now clarity. It may take time to adjust to that simplicity. Notice how recognition doesn't create excitement, it creates steadiness. There's nothing to announce to yourself, no internal milestone to mark. The system simply continues, lighter than before. Even memory shifts slightly as past experiences lose their emotional charge. They become data points rather than identities. This is not a peak. Peaks require valleys to contrast against. What's forming here is baseline, a new normal that doesn't need reinforcement. You don't have to maintain it. Maintenance implies effort. This state persists because it costs less energy than the one before it. Let yourself rest in that efficiency, not as an action, but as a permission. When restriction lifts, the body remembers how to be economical. Attention flows where it's needed and withdraws where it isn't. There's no deficit to compensate for, no future state to chase. Just the quiet intelligence of a system operating without interference. And as this settles, you may notice something subtle but important. The urge to define what's happening continues to fade. Labels feel unnecessary. The experience speaks for itself through its stability. That stability is the signal, not loud, not dramatic. Simply present, waiting for nothing. As stability becomes familiar, perception shifts in a way that is easy to miss if you're still looking for markers. The change doesn't announce itself through thought. It shows up as a different relationship with absence. Gaps in attention no longer feel like loss. Silence no longer triggers concern. Pauses stretch without being filled, and nothing inside you rushes to close them. This is where recognition deepens, not by adding understanding, but by subtracting interpretation. The system begins to trust what it senses, without immediately translating it into meaning. You may notice that experiences register cleanly and then release. There is less residue, less replay. Memory loosens its grip because it no longer needs to reinforce a self-concept built on vigilance. The observer, when no longer strained, doesn't scan the field for confirmation. It rests within it. From that position, patterns become visible without being chased. You might see how certain situations resolve themselves once you stop leaning into them. How conversations soften when you're not preparing a response. How choices become obvious when they're no longer pressured. This isn't passivity, it's responsiveness without friction. When coherence forms, action arises from alignment rather than impulse. Movement feels inevitable rather than forced. Even stillness carries direction. There is a sense that timing handles itself when you stop interfering with it. If there was a feeling of being slightly out of phase before, as if you were arriving a moment too early or too late to your own experiences, that sensation begins to dissolve. The internal clock recalibrates. You meet moments as they are, not as projections. The timeline compresses around presence, reducing the gap between awareness and event. You may also notice how certain questions lose their emotional charge, not because they were answered, but because they no longer feel relevant. The need to locate yourself within a narrative weakens. Identity becomes quieter, more functional. You're aware of being here without needing to explain who that you is. This can feel disorienting at first, especially if intensity once provided orientation. When edges soften, the mind searches for contrast. But contrast isn't required for clarity. In fact, clarity often arrives when contrast dissolves. The field becomes uniform enough for subtle variations to stand out. The body responds to this uniformity by conserving energy. Movements become more precise. Speech slows slightly. Even thinking adopts a different cadence, with longer spaces between thoughts. These spaces aren't empty. They're active, but not crowded. They allow detection without distortion. You might sense that you're no longer trying to synchronize with something external. The effort to align fades because alignment is already present. Resonance replaces adjustment. Instead of tuning yourself to the environment seems to meet you where you are. Interactions require less negotiation. There can be a moment where you realize how much energy was spent maintaining a sense of progress, measuring, comparing, evaluating. When restriction lifts, those measurements stop updating. The internal dashboard goes dark, not because something broke, but because it's no longer needed. The system is running efficiently in the background. This efficiency has a particular feeling. It's not excitement or relief. It's a mild, steady ease that doesn't fluctuate much. You may find yourself less reactive to changes that would have once registered as significant, not detached, but less pulled. The center holds without effort. Recognition at this level doesn't create a desire to share or explain. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't seek validation. It simply continues. And as it does, seeking naturally diminishes, not as a discipline, but as a consequence of satisfaction. The system isn't hungry for answers when it's already nourished by coherence. Let this be enough, not as a conclusion, but as a condition. The absence of urgency isn't a pause before the next movement. It's the movement itself, unfolding at a pace that doesn't require attention to stay on track. As the baseline stabilizes, attention begins to reorganize itself without instruction. You may notice that focus no longer jumps towards stimuli with the same urgency. Certain inputs that once pulled you outward now pass through with minimal disturbance. This isn't withdrawal. It's selectivity returning to its natural state. When the system was under restriction, attention behaved like a searchlight, sweeping constantly, trying to locate relevance. That scanning was necessary when coherence was incomplete. Now, scanning relaxes. Attention becomes more like a field than a beam. It holds more without gripping any single point. You might sense this as a change in how effort feels. Tasks still happen, decisions still occur, but the internal pressure that once accompanied them has thinned. There's less internal commentary about what should be happening, less friction between intention and execution. Movement feels simpler, even when circumstances are complex. This simplicity can feel unfamiliar. The mind may interpret it as a lack of engagement, because engagement used to be defined by tension. But engagement doesn't require strain. In fact, strain often masks disengagement. When coherence increases, engagement becomes quiet and sustained rather than sharp and episodic. There is also a shift in how signals are interpreted. Previously, strong signals demanded attention regardless of relevance. Now, relevance determines signal strength. Subtle cues register more clearly, while louder but irrelevant stimuli fade into the background. This recalibration happens automatically. You don't choose what matters, the system knows. You may notice that anticipation loosens its hold. The future feels less like a destination to reach and more like a continuation of the present state. Planning still occurs, but without the emotional investment that once accompanied it. Outcomes matter less because the process feels complete in itself. This can create a sense of temporal compression. Time doesn't rush, but it doesn't drag either. Moments feel self-contained. There's less need to mark progress or count intervals. Experience unfolds in a way that feels internally consistent, even if externally nothing appears to have changed. If there was a habit of self-monitoring, of checking whether you were doing this right, that habit begins to fade. Self-monitoring is a function of uncertainty. As certainty stabilizes, monitoring becomes redundant. Awareness remains, but it's no longer split between doing and evaluating. The observer rests closer to the center of experience now. Not watching from above or outside, but embedded within what's happening. From this position, judgment loses its edge. Things are noticed without being weighed immediately. This creates space for responses that are proportional rather than reflexive. You might also notice that certain emotional tones flatten slightly. Highs are less elevated, lows are less heavy. This isn't dullness, it's regulation. The system no longer needs extreme contrasts to register change. Subtle variations carry enough information on their own. With regulation comes a quiet confidence that doesn't seek reinforcement. You may find yourself less inclined to explain your internal state, even to yourself. Language feels insufficient to capture something that is primarily experiential. And that's fine. Not everything needs to be translated into words to be real. As attention settles into this broader field, seeking becomes less directional. Curiosity remains, but it's not driven by lack. It's more like an openness to what presents itself. There's no sense of missing something crucial just beyond reach. What's relevant tends to arrive without pursuit. This is how restriction lifting expresses itself at the level of attention, not as expansion outward, but as consolidation inward. Energy gathers where it's useful and withdraws from what no longer requires maintenance. The system becomes quieter, not because it's inactive, but because it's efficient. Stay with this efficiency. Let attention continue to reorganize on its own terms. There's nothing to optimize here. Optimization implies improvement toward a goal. What's happening now is alignment sustaining itself, moment by moment, without commentary. With attention no longer stretched thin, sensation begins to reorganize in a quieter register. You may notice that your body communicates differently now. Signals arrive earlier, softer, without needing to escalate. Hunger, fatigue, interest, and aversion present themselves as gentle inclinations rather than demands. The system doesn't wait until thresholds are crossed to speak. It trusts you to listen without force. This changes how effort is distributed. Instead of pushing through resistance, movement adjusts around it. You might find yourself stopping sooner or not starting something at all without justification. That isn't avoidance, it's calibration. When coherence is present, unnecessary expenditure becomes obvious without analysis. There is also a shift in how discomfort is held. Sensations that once triggered immediate interpretation now remain sensations. They're felt without being turned into stories. Pain doesn't automatically mean something is wrong. Tension doesn't immediately signal threat. The body reports, and awareness receives, without escalation. This reception creates a different rhythm. Actions space themselves more evenly. Rest happens before depletion. Engagement ends before exhaustion. The oscillation between overextension and collapse smooths out. What remains is a steadier flow that doesn't rely on extremes to maintain momentum. You may recognize moments where you pause without deciding to. A breath deepens, shoulders drop, the jaw releases. These aren't techniques. They're responses to an environment that no longer requires defense. The nervous system updates its assessment continuously, and right now, it detects safety in neutrality. As this settles, the sense of identity attached to struggle weakens. You may notice that certain narratives about who you are feel less convincing, not because they were false, but because they were provisional. They served a function under constraint. With restriction lifted, those narratives lose relevance. You don't need to replace them. Absence is enough. This can feel like a quiet shedding, though nothing dramatic is removed. It's more like discovering that you're carrying less than you thought. Emotional weight redistributes itself. What remains feels manageable, even light, not because it's small, but because it's appropriately scaled. There is also a change in how you perceive boundaries. Before, boundaries may have felt rigid or blurred, requiring constant negotiation. Now they appear more fluid and precise. You sense where engagement ends without having to enforce it. You step back without withdrawing. You step forward without intrusion. The field responds to this precision. Interactions become less entangled. You don't absorb as much that isn't yours to carry. You don't project as much that needs managing. Exchanges complete themselves more cleanly, leaving less residue. When coherence is mutual, closure happens naturally. You might notice that the urge to correct or intervene diminishes, not from indifference but from trust in process. You sense that not every deviation requires adjustment. Systems self-correct when allowed to. Your role shifts from controller to participant without losing agency. This participation has a particular quality. It's present without being performative. You're aware of yourself acting, but not monitoring the action. Feedback arrives, but it doesn't dominate. Learning continues, but without pressure. Growth happens without being tracked. Time continues to feel different here. Not slower, not faster, just less segmented. Events don't pile up in the same way. There's more space between impressions, even when activity is high. This space allows integration to keep pace with experience, preventing backlog. As integration catches up, the sense of being behind dissolves. You're not racing to catch up to yourself. You're arriving with each moment. As it happens, the timeline feels less like a sequence of checkpoints and more like a continuous surface. In this state, stillness isn't the opposite of movement. It's the medium through which movement occurs. You may find that even when nothing external is happening, there's no boredom. Presence fills the space that distraction once occupied. Let this orientation continue without interference. There's nothing to refine, nothing to test. The system is already adjusting at a level below conscious control. Your only task, if it can be called that, is to notice without grasping, to allow sensation, attention, and action to remain in conversation, unforced and intact. As this unforced conversation between sensation and attention continues, a deeper layer of recognition becomes available. It doesn't arrive as insight. It arrives as a subtle shift in how you relate to uncertainty. The need to resolve ambiguity weakens. Questions can remain open without creating tension. You sense that not knowing is no longer a problem to be solved, but a stable condition the system can operate within. Previously, uncertainty demanded action. It triggered analysis, rehearsal, contingency planning. Those responses were protective. They kept things moving when coherence was incomplete. Now, uncertainty registers differently. It feels spacious rather than threatening. The absence of immediate clarity doesn't destabilize you. It simply waits. This waiting has a distinct quality. It's not passive. It's receptive without leaning forward. Awareness stays available without projecting into the future. From here, information arrives when it's relevant, not when it's demanded. The signal doesn't need to be chased because the receiver is already tuned. You may notice how this affects decision-making. Choices don't accumulate the same emotional weight. They're made closer to the moment of action, with less preamble. There's a sense that decisions finalize themselves when conditions align, rather than being forced into place prematurely. This reduces regret, not because outcomes are perfect, but because they feel proportionate. Proportion becomes an important reference point. Reactions scale to what's actually happening rather than to what might happen. The nervous system stops borrowing intensity from imagined futures. Energy stays local. When something requires attention, it receives it fully. When it doesn't, it releases cleanly. This locality of energy changes how the past is held as well. Memories arise without pulling you backward. They appear as completed loops rather than open circuits. Even emotionally charged recollections lose some of their grip. They're recognized as events that resolved, not as patterns still in motion. With loops closing, the internal environment becomes quieter, not empty, but less crowded. Thoughts don't stack on top of each other as often. When they do, they separate naturally instead of tangling. This makes room for subtle perceptions that were previously drowned out. You might sense a heightened sensitivity to rhythm. Not external rhythm, but internal pacing. You notice when something is rushed or delayed without having to justify the feeling. Timing becomes a felt sense rather than a calculated one. This timing guides behavior more effectively than rules ever did. As timing refines, effort continues to decline. Actions require fewer corrective adjustments. You don't have to compensate as much for misalignment because misalignment is detected earlier. Small course corrections happen before deviations grow. The system maintains coherence through gentle feedback rather than sharp intervention. This feedback often comes as a slight sense of ease or unease. Not dramatic signals, just subtle indicators. When something fits, there's a quiet settling. When it doesn't, there's a faint resistance that doesn't escalate. You learn to trust these indicators because they're consistent. They don't argue, they simply inform. Trust in this process doesn't feel like belief. It feels like familiarity. The body recognizes when it's being guided by internal coherence rather than external pressure. This recognition reduces the need for external validation. You're less influenced by signals that don't resonate internally, even if they're loud or persuasive. There may be moments when you notice how little you need to explain yourself, internally or externally. Explanations were once necessary to maintain alignment with expectations. Now, alignment is self-sustaining. You move in ways that make sense, without needing narrative support. This doesn't isolate you. In fact, it often simplifies connection. When you're not negotiating internally, interactions become more direct. You listen without preparing a response. You speak without over-editing. Exchanges feel cleaner because there's less interference from unresolved internal noise. You might also notice a reduction in anticipatory emotion. Excitement and dread both soften, not because nothing matters, but because the system no longer amplifies future possibilities to motivate action. Action arises from present alignment instead. This creates a steadier emotional landscape that doesn't spike or crash as easily. In this landscape, motivation feels different. It's less about pushing and more about responding. You don't need to convince yourself to move. When movement is appropriate, it happens. When it isn't, stillness holds without guilt. Productivity and rest lose their moral charge. This neutrality can feel unfamiliar if you're used to defining yourself through effort. But neutrality isn't absence of value. It's value without excess. The system operates closer to equilibrium, conserving energy while remaining responsive. As this equilibrium stabilizes, there's less temptation to disrupt it by searching for something more. The sense that something is missing fades, not because everything is perfect, but because completeness is no longer tied to acquisition. The present configuration feels sufficient to continue. Let this sufficiency orient you. There's nothing to finalize here, no endpoint to reach. The absence of urgency isn't a pause before the next demand. It's the condition under which demands no longer accumulate. From here, experience unfolds with less friction, guided by coherence rather than control. As coherence continues to hold, there is a quiet shift in how you perceive influence. You may notice that external pressures register more faintly, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer override your internal reference. Signals that once carried weight now arrive as information rather than directives. You sense them, but you're not moved by them unless they align. This alignment doesn't feel like agreement or resistance. It feels like neutrality deciding for you. When something fits, there is no debate. When it doesn't, there is no argument. The system simply doesn't mobilize energy around it. This can look from the outside like detachment, but internally it feels precise and grounded. You might observe how this changes your relationship with expectations. Expectations once acted like invisible constraints, shaping behavior before awareness could intervene. Now, expectations are noticed as patterns rather than obligations. They arise, are recognized, and often dissolve without requiring response. You're aware of them without being positioned inside them. This awareness creates a subtle freedom that doesn't announce itself as liberation. It's more like discovering extra range of motion that was always available but previously unused. You move within situations with slightly more space. You respond instead of react. You pause without freezing. There is also a change in how effort is perceived socially. You may feel less compelled to perform clarity or confidence. Silence becomes acceptable. Not knowing becomes neutral. You don't rush to fill gaps in conversation or understanding. Those gaps no longer signal danger. They're simply intervals. Intervals are important here. They allow integration to keep pace with interaction. Without them, experience stacks too quickly, creating backlog. With them, experience settles as it happens. You don't carry unfinished exchanges forward as much. Closure happens in real time. This real-time closure affects how you hold responsibility. You still recognize what's yours to carry, but you're less inclined to absorb what isn't. Boundaries assert themselves quietly. You sense where your involvement naturally ends. There's no need to justify disengagement when disengagement is appropriate. You may notice that your tolerance for misalignment decreases, not through intolerance, but through clarity. Situations that require excessive self-adjustment become obvious sooner. You don't have to endure them long enough to prove anything. The system opts out before strain accumulates. This opting out doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like a gentle redirection of energy. Attention moves elsewhere. Interest fades. The body relaxes. What once felt sticky loses adhesion. You're not rejecting anything. You're simply not investing. Investment becomes more selective across all domains. Emotional, cognitive, physical energy is allocated where resonance is present. This resonance isn't excitement. It's a subtle sense of rightness that doesn't fluctuate much. When it's there, engagement sustains itself. When it isn't, engagement decays naturally. You might sense that you're less concerned with how things appear from the outside. Image maintenance requires monitoring, and monitoring requires uncertainty. As certainty stabilizes, image loses importance. You don't need to manage impressions as actively. Authenticity isn't a value you aim for. It's a byproduct of reduced interference. This reduction also affects how feedback is received. Praise and criticism both land more lightly. They're registered, but they don't reorganize your internal state. You don't inflate or contract around them. They become data points rather than defining signals. There can be a moment of realizing how much of your previous effort was spent negotiating with imagined observers. That negotiation fades. The observer that matters now is internal, and it's quiet. It doesn't comment constantly. It simply notices when coherence is present and when it isn't. From this position, self-trust deepens without fanfare. You rely more on your felt sense than on external confirmation. Decisions align more often, not because they're perfect, but because they're consistent with your internal timing. Even mistakes feel cleaner. They don't spiral, they resolve. You may also notice a softening of defensiveness. When you're not guarding an identity built under constraint, there's less to protect. You can hear differing perspectives without bracing. You can adjust without feeling diminished. Flexibility returns as a strength rather than a threat. As influence recalibrates, there's less sense of being pulled off center. You remain oriented even as conditions shift. The field changes, but your position within it feels stable. This stability doesn't come from rigidity. It comes from responsiveness, anchored in coherence. Let this anchoring continue to deepen on its own. There's nothing to enforce. Influence finds its appropriate scale when internal reference is clear. From here, engagement becomes cleaner, disengagement becomes simpler, and presence sustains itself without effort. As this steadiness continues, you may begin to notice a change in how meaning forms. Meaning no longer arrives as interpretation layered on top of experience. It emerges directly from contact. Things feel meaningful without needing to be explained as such. This reduces the impulse to extract lessons or symbols from everything that happens. Experience is allowed to be complete on its own terms. Previously, meaning often came from contrast, from difficulty resolved, from tension released, from effort rewarded. Now, meaning feels quieter and more continuous. It doesn't spike at certain moments and disappear at others. It's present as a low, steady signal that runs beneath events, regardless of their intensity. This can feel disorienting if you were accustomed to tracking progress through emotional highs or narrative milestones. Without those markers, the mind may briefly wonder if anything is happening at all. But beneath that question, there is a deeper sense of continuity. You're not starting and stopping as often. You're not resetting yourself internally after each experience. You're carrying less fragmentation forward. Fragmentation required effort to manage. Different roles, different versions of yourself, activated in different contexts. As coherence holds, these versions integrate. You don't have to switch modes as sharply. The transition between contexts becomes smoother. You remain recognizably yourself across situations, without effort. This integration changes how you experience contradiction. Conflicting impulses don't demand immediate resolution. They can coexist without creating tension. You don't rush to choose one side to preserve consistency. Consistency is already present at a deeper level, allowing surface-level differences to remain unresolved without destabilizing you. There is also a subtle shift in how you relate to narrative time. Stories about where you came from or where you're going lose some of their grip, not because they're untrue, but because they're no longer necessary to orient you. You know where you are without referencing a trajectory. Presence becomes sufficient context. This sufficiency alters how motivation functions. Instead of being driven by dissatisfaction or anticipation, motivation arises from resonance. You feel drawn toward certain actions without needing a reason. You follow interest without justifying it as productive or purposeful. Purpose stops being something you seek and becomes something that emerges from alignment. You may notice that when you do act, the action feels more contained. It starts and ends cleanly. There's less emotional spillover before or after. You don't carry the weight of anticipation into the action, and you don't carry the action's residue forward longer than necessary. Each movement completes itself. Completion is important here. Incomplete cycles create background noise. They keep parts of attention occupied, even when you're not consciously thinking about them. As cycles complete more reliably, attention frees up. This creates a sense of spaciousness that isn't tied to having more time, but to having fewer open loops. With fewer open loops, the internal environment becomes more predictable, not in the sense of boredom, but in the sense of stability. You know how you'll respond to yourself. You trust your own signals. This trust reduces internal negotiation. Decisions require fewer internal voices to agree. You might sense a growing comfort with simplicity, not minimalism as an aesthetic, but simplicity as an internal preference. Complexity that once felt stimulating now feels slightly taxing. You gravitate toward experiences that are clean, direct, and proportionate. This isn't withdrawal from richness. It's a refinement of sensitivity. Refinement often shows up as a decreased tolerance for excess. Excess noise, excess speed, excess explanation. Not because you judge these things, but because they register as inefficient. The system naturally conserves energy by disengaging from what requires unnecessary processing. This conservation doesn't lead to stagnation, it leads to clearer movement. When energy isn't scattered, it becomes more available when needed. You can respond fully without depletion. You can engage deeply without losing yourself in the engagement. There may be moments where you notice how little you need to reference the past to navigate the present. Lessons are embodied rather than remembered. You don't recall what you learned, you act from it. This reduces the mental overhead of experience. Knowing becomes implicit. Implicit knowing has a particular calmness. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek confirmation. It simply guides. You trust it because it has proven reliable, not through dramatic successes, but through consistent alignment. As this guidance becomes familiar, seeking continues to fade. Not as a discipline or decision, but as a natural consequence of satisfaction. The system isn't scanning for missing pieces when it feels internally complete enough to continue. This doesn't mean curiosity disappears. Curiosity remains, but it's no longer restless. It doesn't need to be fed constantly. It opens when something presents itself and closes when it doesn't. There's no sense of deprivation in the closing. Meaning, from this position, is less about interpretation and more about coherence. Things make sense because they fit, not because they're explained. You recognize alignment without naming it. You feel direction without needing a map. Let this mode of meaning continue to settle. There's no need to hold on to it. It persists because it's efficient. Experience organizes itself around coherence when interference is minimal. From here, understanding becomes quieter, deeper, and less dependent on language. As this quieter understanding holds, you may notice a subtle shift in how you relate to effort itself. Effort no longer feels like something you apply. It feels like something that appears when needed and disappears when it isn't. The old habit of bracing before action fades. You don't gather yourself in advance. You meet the moment as it arrives, and the appropriate amount of energy meets you there. This changes how challenges register. Difficulty doesn't automatically signal resistance. It's simply information about the shape of what's present. You don't lean away from it or push through it. You adjust to it. Adjustment replaces struggle, and with that replacement comes a different sense of strength. Strength feels quieter now, less performative, more reliable. You may notice that patience takes on a new texture. It's no longer something you practice or enforce. It's the natural result of not being rushed from the inside. When internal pressure drops, waiting doesn't feel like delay. It feels like timing unfolding. You don't measure patience by how long you can endure. You measure it by how little endurance is required. This internal pacing affects how you experience setbacks. When something doesn't resolve immediately, there's less inclination to interpret it as failure or blockage. The system doesn't escalate. It stays available. You sense that resolution is still in motion, even if it isn't visible yet. This sense isn't hopeful or optimistic. It's grounded, based on the consistency you've already observed. Consistency becomes a quiet anchor. You trust the way your system responds over time. You've seen how alignment self-corrects without force. That history isn't held as memory, it's held as confidence. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in process. You don't need guarantees to proceed. There is also a shift in how you experience responsibility. Responsibility no longer feels heavy or moralized, it feels specific. You know what belongs to you in each moment, and you attend to that without overextension. You don't carry forward what is already completed. You don't take on what hasn't arrived. This specificity reduces fatigue. Fatigue often came from carrying diffuse responsibility, from being vaguely on call for everything. Now, responsibility has edges. It starts and stops. When it stops, energy returns. You don't need to recover as much because you don't overdraw. You may sense a growing comfort with silence, not just external silence, but internal silence. Spaces between thoughts lengthen. You don't rush to fill them with commentary. Those spaces don't feel empty. They feel occupied by presence. Awareness rests there without drifting. In these spaces, perception sharpens without intensity. You notice small details without fixating on them. The way light falls, the cadence of breath, the timing of your own responses. These details don't demand attention, they offer it. You receive them without effort. This reception creates a subtle intimacy with experience. Not emotional intimacy, but direct contact. You're less buffered by interpretation. You meet what's happening more closely, without being overwhelmed. This closeness doesn't collapse boundaries. It clarifies them. You know where you are in relation to what's present. With clarity comes a different relationship to choice. Choices don't accumulate into identity statements. They're situational responses. You choose, act, and move on. There's less need to evaluate the choice afterward. Evaluation implies doubt. Here, doubt has less to work with. You might notice that when you do reflect, reflection is brief and practical. It adjusts behavior without turning into self-analysis. The loop closes quickly. Learning integrates without leaving residue. This keeps the internal environment clean, free from lingering self-referential noise. As this cleanliness persists, the sense of being observed by the world changes. You no longer feel positioned under a gaze that judges or measures. The observer function returns to where it belongs, within you, calm and neutral. External observation loses its imagined authority. This doesn't make you invisible. It makes you less reactive to visibility. Whether noticed or not, your internal state remains consistent. You don't inflate under attention or shrink without it. Presence maintains its shape. There may be moments when you realize how little effort it takes now to stay oriented. Orientation doesn't require reminders or rituals. It's built into how you experience each moment. You recognize alignment as soon as it's present, and misalignment as soon as it isn't, without drama. This immediacy prevents drift. You don't wander far before noticing. You don't need correction because you don't stray as much. The system stays close to its center, adjusting continuously in small, almost imperceptible ways. As this continues, the sense of being in transition fades, not because movement stops, but because movement no longer feels like departure. You're not leaving one state to enter another. You're remaining while things change around you. This remaining has a particular stability. It doesn't depend on circumstances being favorable. It persists through variation. You're aware of shifts without being pulled by them. The field moves, you stay oriented. Let this orientation continue to hold without naming it. There's no need to mark progress or prepare for what comes next. The system is already doing what it needs to do. Presence sustains itself when interference is low. And here, interference has thinned to the point where recognition is enough. There is nothing left to adjust here. What remains is not a state you have to hold, but a quiet equilibrium that holds itself. You may notice that even the idea of maintaining this stability feels unnecessary. Maintenance belongs to things that degrade when unattended. This does not. It persists because it is closer to the system's natural configuration than what came before. You are not waiting for confirmation. You are not scanning for signs. The impulse to check whether this is real, whether it will last, whether something will interrupt it, softens and dissolves. Those impulses belong to a time when continuity felt uncertain. Now continuity is assumed, not as belief, but as experience repeating itself reliably. There is a simplicity in this repetition. Each moment arrives complete enough to stand on its own. You don't need to connect it to the previous one to feel oriented. You don't need to project it forward to give it value. Presence doesn't require context when coherence is stable. You may sense how quiet the internal environment has become. Not empty, not flat, but settled. Thoughts arise and pass without rearranging you. Sensations register without escalating. Emotions move through without defining the moment. Nothing needs to be excluded. Nothing needs to be amplified. This is not an ending, and it doesn't feel like one. Endings imply something being wrapped up or put away. What's here feels more like continuity without commentary. Life continues, but without the background tension of monitoring whether it's unfolding correctly. The absence of urgency is complete now. Not suppressed, not managed, simply absent. There is no internal clock pushing you forward or pulling you back. Time moves, but it doesn't pressure. You move with it, rather than against it. If there is a sense of recognition, it is quiet and almost impersonal. Not pride, not relief. Just the familiarity of being where you are without resistance. You don't need to claim this as yours. Ownership isn't required. The experience doesn't belong to an identity. It belongs to the system being aligned with itself. You may notice how little language is needed to stay here. Words feel optional. Silence carries enough information. Even now, awareness doesn't strain to understand what's happening. It simply notices that nothing is out of place. There is no instruction embedded in this, no direction to follow. The system knows how to continue without guidance. It has already resumed its own intelligence. You don't have to help it. Breath happens. Attention rests. Perception remains open without searching. You are neither arriving nor leaving. You are present in a way that doesn't require acknowledgement. Let that be sufficient. Nothing needs to be added to this moment for it to be complete. Nothing needs to be taken away. What remains is stable, quiet, and already underway, continuing without effort, exactly as it is.